So today, I don't know how many of you saw the email, but talking about the teachings of Jesus. And the reason I picked this topic, well, I'll explain it to you. Earlier this week, I was telling someone at work, actually, that I needed to prepare for a talk that I was going to be doing this Sunday. And the woman asked me what the talk was for. Was it to do with work or to do with something else? And I kind of stumbled on the word that it was for church. I found I was hesitant to say the word, and I realized that I'm kind of nervous about it. And as I reflected on that, I started thinking about the traditional Christian church and how very few people who are my age or in my circle of friends go to church regularly. The few that I do know who go tend to go to fundamentalist churches, and while it works for them, I don't always agree with their interpretation of the teachings of Jesus. Although I do consider myself a follower of Jesus. And then I realized, as I started thinking a little bit deeper, because I was really disturbed by this stumbling, I started to understand that the reason I feel so uncomfortable is that I'm uncomfortable with the amount of pain that the traditional church has caused. And I don't want to be identified with it. And I don't want to be seen as agreeing with it. And as I thought about that more, I thought of the many people around my age group, all age groups around the world, who have sworn off church. And a lot of that has to do with the dogma associated with church. And I thought how sad it is that in doing so, we've deprived ourselves, we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. We've deprived ourselves of the very excellent teachings that Jesus had, that remind us that we're spiritual beings. And Jesus reminded us that we have the power to live and love with joy, wisdom, and peace, right here, right now, in this human experience. Can anyone relate to my experience and my discomfort? I imagine many people, especially if they're in a New Thought church, have that same, how do you marry the love of the teaching with the doctrine? So then I thought, okay, what did Jesus really teach us? And this book came to mind. I read this many, many, many years ago, but it kind of popped into my head, so I picked it up again. And in this book, Eric Butterworth wrote the book, tells us of an old Hindu legend. There was a time when all men were gods, but they so abused their divinity that Brahma, the chief god, decided to take it away from them and hide it where they would never find it again. Where to hide it became the question. So he turned over the problem to the lesser gods. The lesser gods said, well, let's put it up, man's divinity, up on a mountain. And then they thought, no, because man will climb mountains and they will find it eventually. How about we bury it in the sand? No, man will dig and eventually they'll find it. How about under the ocean? No, they'll eventually know how to go deep, 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 and they will find their divinity. Finally, in desperation, they turned back to Brahma. And Brahma said, here's what we'll do with man's divinity. We'll hide it deep down in man himself, for he will never think to look for it there. And ever since then, man has been going up and down the earth, climbing, digging, diving, flying, searching for something that is already in himself. Butterworth then says, and I quote, 2,000 years ago, a man named Jesus found it and shared its secret. But in the movement that sprang up in his name, the divinity of man has been the best kept secret of all the ages. Cool. I think that's really neat. He goes on to say, and I quote again, in his search for the Holy Grail, man has looked everywhere and in vain, but has failed to look within himself. Occasionally a prophet came, telling of the world within. But instead of following him into the deeper experience, man invariably made a god of the prophet, worshipped him, and built monuments to him. They then trapped themselves into a religious practice that had no within. End quote. Butterworth's position is that the traditional Christian church is the religion about Jesus rather than the religion of Jesus. And so today, I invite you to join with me on this journey of examining some of the accepted tenets of the church about Jesus. Some of these thoughts are bound to make us uncomfortable. Some may seem downright sacrilegious. We may not agree with each other, and that's okay. My goal is to share with you the ideas that were in this book and that have come to me independently. What I'm hoping is to share the idea that there may be a different possibility out there than the dogmatic creed that is accepted and dying to some extent in the traditional church. Because, as I said before, the message that Jesus taught us is still relevant for us today. And what did he teach us and how? He taught us in parables. He taught us in sayings, gave us instructions. He healed. And he gave us only two commandments. I figure if we get these, we get the teachings of Jesus. And in short, in these two commandments, he teaches us that we are one with the divine energy that we call God. Now, the new commandments are found in Matthew in chapter 12. And the first is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these two. In short, Jesus was teaching us to be in right relationship with God, to be in right relationship with each other, and to be in right relationship with ourselves. And what is that right relationship? It's love. Love God, love each other, love yourself. And so what does he mean by the word love? That feeling of love always expresses as this feeling of joy, of abundance, of wanting to share, of oneness and trust. It's a feeling of connectedness and well-being, expansive. And we all want that feeling. And part of the issue for us is that we use it so loosely that we don't often really think about what it means. And by that I mean, we say we love chocolate, as well as we love our job, or we love the beautiful day, or we love the car. And I think actually the reason we do that is because we do experience sometimes only momentary pieces of joy when we're having chocolate. Carries on somewhere else on my body for a whole bunch longer. But that feeling is real. That feeling of satisfaction, of pleasure, is really what love is. And so for the purposes of our thinking today, I want you to share with me in thinking of love, instead of the word love, as being at one with. Being at one with. Think in terms of being together and at one with. And if we consider Jesus' first commandment with this definition, it looks like this. Jesus said, love God at every level of our being. Our hearts, our minds, our souls, and our bodies, our strength. The Message translation of the Bible with that same passage reads, love the Lord your God with all your passion and prayer and intelligence and energy. Using that definition then, Jesus asks us to be at one with God at every level of our being, with our hearts, our passions, our souls, our powerful prayer, our minds, our intelligence, our body, our energy. So what are we loving? What are we being at one with when we use the word God? For some of us, and in many religions about Jesus, God is pictured as being up in the heavens, white flowing robe, long beard, staff in one hand, most importantly, the clipboard on the other, taking notes, keeping track, making sure that we're observing our holy days correctly, that we're saying our prayers, that we're going to church, that we're checking off the boxes of all the things we're supposed to do. This God is a God of judgment. He is to be feared. He is to be appeased. We don't want him to get mad at us. That God is out there to be worshipped and prayed to, adored, sometimes negotiated with when we're in a crisis. Who hasn't done that? We've all done that. Oh God, if only you let me do this, I promise I will. The motivating factor behind the worship of this God is fear. It's fear that we're not going to get into heaven. It's fear that God won't be on our side. This God plays favorites, and we want to make sure we're on the winning side. So what did Jesus say about God? He often referred to God as Father. That implies unity with God. God is my Father. I am God's child. But Jesus also said that we are all brothers. So if we take that to its logical conclusion, using the intelligence that we just spoke about, if Jesus viewed God as Father and us as brothers, then he must expect that we view God as Father too. Jesus never set himself up as being any different in potential than we are. Never. The God that Jesus knew was not fickle. His love is everlasting and unchanging, a constant, regardless of how badly we behave. In Matthew, Jesus likens God's love to the sun when he says, "The sun shines on the good and the evil equally." The love is principle. It's not more for you because you're being good today and bad for you because you've been a naughty boy. The love is no different in principle than gravity. Gravity doesn't say, "Oh, for you I'm going to keep you on the ground, and for you, no, not so much." Doesn't work. God is eternal, principle love. Our names and mental images for God may be quite different. You may think of God as spirit, universal creator, father, the force, energy, as a he or a she, as light. My personal favorite, as most of you probably know, is from Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. I do. I get it. I can understand his concept better than anything else I've been able to figure out. And that is, he refers to the force as, and I quote, an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the universe together. I can sort of understand that better than the judgmental guy. But if the judgmental guy works for you, it is yours. Paul puts it this way: in God we live and move and have our being, for we are also his offspring. End quote. It may be helpful to think of God in terms of, say, an ocean. And if God is the ocean, we are the water. There is no separation, really, between where the water ends and the ocean begins. We're all part of the same soup. We are all, therefore, inherently divine, because there is no place that we are that God is not. When we follow the commandment to love God, to be at one with God, we are aware then that there is no separation between God and ourselves. The religion about Jesus stresses the divinity of Jesus and doesn't address, in fact, says man is sinner. In the religion of Jesus, Jesus teaches the divinity of man. Big difference. And it is true that Jesus did amazing things that normal people can't do. So how do we make sense of his insistence that, as he said, I say to you, he who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works than these will he do. Or as he reminds the people, is it not written in your law that I said you are gods? So how do you understand that he's able to do these things and we aren't, but we're supposed to be brothers? That we're supposed to be equally divine. And the difference, I believe, is in how he lived and showed up in his oneness with God. For him, oneness with God was his way of life. And he knew his oneness with the presence and power that we call God so well that he truly walked, talked, and lived as God. As Charles Fillmore said, and I quote this, we cannot separate Jesus Christ from God or tell where man leaves off and God begins. To say that we are men, as Jesus was a man, is not exactly true, because he had dropped that personal consciousness by which we separate ourselves from our true God self. He had no consciousness separate from that of being. Therefore, he was this being to all intents and purposes. Yet he attained no more than what is expected of every one of us. End quote. In unity, we call this awareness of our oneness with each other and our oneness with God, and that place where we connect, the Christ consciousness. Our challenge is to live in this awareness of our oneness with God and with each other all the time, just like Jesus did. And when Jesus said, "Follow me," I believe he meant for us to live in this space. His message was not that we should worship him. It was for us to follow and learn from his example and become completely and consciously aware that we are one with God, as he was one with God. When we have that knowledge enabled him to tap into the divine powers, those creative and healing powers that he demonstrated in his travels. His promise is hard for us to believe, and that is, greater works than these will he do. So the religion about Jesus is not wrong. Jesus is divine. The religion of Jesus adds, so are we. The second commandment has two parts. And I thought that was interesting and thought about that for quite a while. Why that one is its own sentence, love God. And the other one isn't love your neighbor as its own sentence, and then love yourself as its own sentence. Those two are combined. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love. Be at one with your neighbor. Love. Be at one with yourself. Why are they in the same sentence? What does that mean? Jesus taught us much that seems counterintuitive about loving, especially loving our neighbor. Until we remember that the two parts are part of the same sentence. And then he reminds us constantly that we're all connected. That whatever we do to each other, we are doing to ourselves. That when we are creating a hell for somebody else, we're creating it for ourselves. When we are angry at somebody else, we are creating a hell for ourselves. At that point, we are not loving ourselves. So to be in right relationship with the divine within us, we need to be at one with our neighbors and ourselves. Tough. So much easier to hold a grudge. It feels better. I mean, it's natural. You hurt me, I want to hurt you back. Jesus gives us some tough guidelines to follow, especially if we take them literally. In many ways, though, it is easier to understand their meanings if we look at the teachings metaphorically or metaphysically. So, for example, on the subject of holding a grudge or getting even, Jesus tells us that what was taught in the past was take an eye for an eye, take a tooth for a tooth. But now he wants us to turn the other cheek. No, that doesn't feel right. If somebody compels us to walk 1 mile, he wants us to go with them for 2. Why? That doesn't feel right. It doesn't make sense on the surface. It sounds like I'm going to get taken advantage of. What Jesus is saying is that there's no point in trying to get even with someone who has wronged you. Butterworth says it this way: you may hold a person in enmity for the rest of your days, reminding yourself constantly of what he did to you. But every time you display this enmity, you are holding up your manacles and saying, see, I'm making him pay. But you've become the slave in the process. The only way you can get even is to take off the manacles. Get rid of the enmity and you can go free. That's the end of that quote. Turning the other cheek does not mean that we turn our heads to take another blow. I think we can safely look at that saying metaphorically. In which case, turning the other cheek means being willing to see the situation from a different viewpoint. Instead of looking at it from a human viewpoint, we can choose to see it from the viewpoint of divinity. From that part of us that can never be hurt, that knows that no one can take our good from us. And in this divine state of consciousness, the influence of the other person is completely nullified. Here's an example, again, from Discover the Power Within You, and I quote, Sidney Harris tells of visiting a Quaker friend for a weekend. Each evening, he would walk to the corner with his friend to buy the evening newspaper. His friend would be cheerful and pleasant at the store, but the newsie would always reply with a grunt. Harris commented one night, "He's a mighty unpleasant fellow, isn't he?" The friend replied, "Yeah, he's always that way." So this guy said, "But why are you so nice to him?" And the Quaker friend replied, "Why should I let him determine how I am going to act?" End quote. In this non-resistance, we're able to stay in our power, to remain in contact with our divinity, and to act from that consciousness. And by doing so, we can always act from a place of fullness of life. Always access our joy and our peace. The only reason we see something as an error condition is because we've given it that label in our thinking. When we withdraw the thought about it, the error disappears. Turning the other cheek is like turning on a light in a dark room. The darkness disappears. Really, it was never there in the first place. There just was no light. We can meet every experience, no matter how unpleasant or uncertain, on the level of our divinity simply by turning the other cheek. It's a different way of looking at that. Interesting. Something to think of. Another difficult message that Jesus had for us is love your enemy. He essentially says that if you love those that love you, well, whoop-de-doo. Everybody can do that. What makes you so special? He's asking us to love those who disagree with us. Those people who get under our skin, who are challenging to us, who are unpleasant. He's reminding us that the love that we are called upon to show up as is unconditional. True love is unconditional. It doesn't depend on how the other person receives it. How many times have we been in a relationship where we're in love until the other person doesn't love us anymore, and then we don't love them either? That's a contract. Love is unconditional. Love is a divine energy that begins in God and has no end. And Shakespeare, in one of his beautiful, beautiful sonnets, says, "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds." Jesus is asking us to show up in love always, regardless of what is going on in the other party. And finally, no good church service would be complete without a little dose of sin. Let's take a moment to consider the concept of sin. Sin and error pining. Love it. The religion about Jesus talks about original sin. Basically, it implies that simply by us being on the planet, by virtue of being human, we are doomed to be a miserable sinner forever, and that the best we can hope for is to be a pretty good sinner. I always hated that. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm not that bad. The origin of the word sin comes from the Greek term, I believe, but it comes from the term missing the mark. As in, when letting loose an arrow and it catches the wind just a bit and wobbles and it misses the bullseye. It misses the mark. In Christian theology, there is general agreement that, and I quote, sin occurs when man is out of harmony with the source of his being. Thus, sin is a sense of separation from God. End quote. But we already said earlier that we can't be separate from God. God is everywhere present. God is part of that cosmic soup that we all swim in, that we are all around and in and through and as us. When we sin, then we are simply in a state of forgetting that we are one with God, that we're forgetting our oneness. That is our error. And I guess from that point of view, we do sin pretty often. Oops. Good news is, there is good news, that we always have the opportunity to rethink and repent. That's what that is. To go back and go, I'm going to do it again differently next time. That's all that it means. All we have to do is choose in an instant to be willing to look at that situation differently and learn from it. And what did Jesus then teach us about sin? That we're not punished for our sin. We're punished by our sin. Because when we forget we're connected, that's when we start judging. That's when we start being miserable. That's when we start forgetting that we have much to be grateful for, and we end up creating hell for ourselves. We're punishing ourselves by our error thinking. We forget to see with spiritual eyes, and instead, when we see with those human eyes of ego, we're separated from the goodness, from the harmony, from the peace, from heaven, and we create hell for ourselves. So, the best way to love our neighbor and to love ourselves is to let go of the judgments, to look with spiritual eyes, to demand to see the divinity beneath the situation, and to allow ourselves the peace of God. Robert Browning wrote poetry, Walt, his favorite thing. Truth is within ourselves. He's taking a poetry course and loving it, I'm telling you. Anyway, truth is within ourselves. It takes no rise from outward things, whatever you may believe. There is an inmost center in us all where truth abides in fullness, and around, wall upon wall, the gross flesh hems it in, this perfect, clear perception which is truth. A baffling and perverting carnal mesh binds it and makes all error. And to know rather consists in opening out a way whence the imprisoned splendor may escape, rather than effecting entry for a light supposed to be from without. End quote. Imprisoned splendor. That's what we got. Jesus said that he came that we may have life and have it more abundantly. He told us that we are the light of the world. He told us that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And he gave us assurances that it is God's good pleasure to give each of us the keys to the kingdom. You, me, everybody on this planet is endowed with innate divinity. We need only turn on the light. We need only open the doorway to our God power, to our Christ consciousness, so that our imprisoned splendor may escape. By getting our human consciousness out of the way, loving God, loving each other, loving ourselves with all our hearts, our souls, our minds, and our bodies. The divinity in me honors the divinity in you.